The desert does not laugh. It only watches and remembers. That was the way the story was told to me, not with shouts or bright words, but with the slow bending of a voice older than mine, a voice that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Picture, if you can, the wide plains of the West, a sun burning copper red as it sinks, dust curling around the boots of men who believe themselves kings. And into their careless hands, one day, was placed a woman who carried more grace in her silence than they could ever muster in their roaring. Her name was Iana. It meant eternal blossom among her people, though to the men who brought her, she was nothing more than a cruel jest, a pawn in their game of mockery. She was not brought to the ranch in ceremony, nor in kindness. No ribbons, no church bells, no soft whisper of approval. She was brought in the back of a wagon, her wrists bound with rope, her dark hair tangled with dust, her eyes lowered though not broken. The men laughed when they pulled her down from the cart. They laughed as if she were a prize pig, something to be shown, not cherished. There he stood, the cowboy meant to receive her, tall, loud, full of shallow bravado. His name drifts in the smoke of memory, but I will call him Jed, for he was every Jed, every man who measured worth by the weight of his own voice and not by the steadiness of his deeds. They shoved her toward him, cheering, jeering, as if it were all sport. Jed spat in the dust, tipped his hat back, and let the laughter roll. "Well, boys," he said, his voice thick with arrogance, "looks like I got myself a wild one. Let's see how long till she breaks." And the crowd roared, pleased with their cruelty. But she did not break. She stood, shoulders straight, her eyes soft and steady like twilight over the mesas. She made no plea, no sound of resistance. Silence was her dignity, and though they mistook it for weakness, it was stronger than any curse she could have thrown at them. The days that followed were long, cruel days. Jed made it clear to everyone that she was no wife of his. He said it loud in the saloon, loud at the table, loud in the yard. He made her sleep outside by the sheds, made her scrub floors until her knuckles bled, made her fetch water though the well was half a mile from the ranch house. Every jest at her expense was a chance for him to prove he had not been bested by the joke. And the men joined him, because mockery is easier than kindness. They would call her savage, call her broken, tell her she would never belong. And through it all, Iana remained quiet. But do not mistake her quiet for surrender. She moved through that place like a shadow, yet her presence was undeniable. She worked with a grace that unsettled them. Even when sweat dripped into her eyes, even when her feet blistered raw, she carried herself as if the work was beneath her and not consuming her. At night, when the stars burned white against the velvet dark, she would hum softly to herself. No one understood the words, but the sound carried across the yard, low and haunting, like wind moving through canyon stone. Some said it unsettled them, others that it made their bones ache with something they did not understand. Jed, more than anyone, hated it. Among the men of the ranch, there were many faces. Loud ones, cruel ones, indifferent ones. But among them was one who was quiet. Not timid, not weak, but steady as oak. His name was Elijah. He did not join the laughter. He did not spit insults. He worked with his hands, steady and sure, tending to the horses, mending the fences, driving cattle with a patience that made the beasts trust him. It was Elijah who noticed the way Iana's fingers trembled after carrying buckets too heavy. Elijah who, without a word, left a dipper of water where she might find it. Elijah who, in the hush before dawn, caught the sound of her song and bowed his head as if it were a prayer. He did not step forward, not then, but his silence was different from hers. Hers was armor, his was respect, and though they did not yet speak, something passed between them in those fleeting glances. Not romance, not yet, but recognition, like two lone fires smoldering across a dark plain, aware of each other's light. The ranch hands, the widow who cooked meals in the big house, the children who ran wild near the corrals. All of them saw Iana, though most looked away. Some pitied her, some despised her. A few admired her, though they dared not say it. There was a stable boy, no more than 12, who watched her with wide eyes. He once brought her a scrap of cornbread, hidden in his pocket. She took it with a nod, broke it in half, and gave the other piece back to him. He never forgot the taste, nor the kindness. There was the widow, her hands wrinkled from washing, who sometimes paused to watch Ayanna work. In her silence was a recognition too deep to voice. The recognition of a woman forced to carry a burden that was not hers to bear. As the days stretched into weeks, Jed grew restless. He had expected her to beg, to cry, to fight. But she did none of these. Her silence shamed him in ways laughter never could. He grew harsher, more cruel in his need to prove himself. He mocked her in front of visitors, told them she was useless, told them she had been given to him because no one else would take her. And still she carried water, tended animals, swept floors, as though each chore was beneath her notice. The ranch grew colder for it, not in weather, but in spirit. The laughter that had once filled the yard began to sound hollow. Some men avoided looking at her. Others grew quieter when she passed. Jed did not notice or did not care. One evening, as the sky bled crimson and the last cattle were being driven into the pens, Ayanna stood at the edge of the field, her figure outlined by the dying sun. Elijah, wiping dust from his hands, looked up and saw her. She met his gaze for only a heartbeat. But in that moment, the air shifted. It was not longing, not yet. It was recognition, the kind that says, I see you. I know your strength. You are not invisible. And though no words were spoken, something settled between them, like the first stone in a foundation. The old voice that told me this story leaned closer to the fire then, eyes reflecting the flame. They thought they had played a cruel trick, the voice whispered. They thought they had broken her. But the desert does not laugh. It only waits. And sometimes the seed they meant for mockery grows into the tree that shelters us all. And the fire cracked, as if to agree. Morning in the west is not gentle. It comes sharp, like a knife drawn from its sheath. The sun cuts across the land, burning away shadows, demanding endurance from all who live beneath it. For Ayanna, each dawn was a test. She rose before the others, the hem of her dress already heavy with dust, her hands raw from the bucket handles. The ranch demanded more from her than it did from men twice her size, yet she carried her burdens without sound. She fetched water, scrubbed the wooden floors of the bunkhouse, mended torn shirts, and sometimes tended the horses, though Jed never trusted her with beasts he considered worth coin. He called her names, called her a burden, called her the joke that won't end. The men laughed when he said it. But laughter, like whiskey, grows bitter when swallowed too often. By the third week, fewer men joined his jests. By the sixth, their chuckles grew half-hearted. By the 12th, the silence after his words hung heavier than the insult itself. Yet Jed never noticed. The land around the ranch was wide and unyielding. Sagebrush scattered like whispers across the plains. The skies so endless it seemed to crush the earth with its weight. Coyotes sang at night. Hawks circled by day. It was in this vastness that Ayanna learned her own small rhythms. When she carried water, she counted her steps with old songs her grandmother once taught her. When she cleaned the floorboards, she traced patterns of her homeland in the soap's lather, weaving invisible prayers into the wood. When she was sent to the stables, she hummed under her breath, low and steady, and the horses turned their ears toward her as if they understood. It was not rebellion. It was survival. For when the world strips you of voice, you must find a language the world cannot touch. Elijah noticed. He was a man of few words, his silence not born of fear but of choice. His strength was steady, not loud, the kind that worked from dawn to dusk without demand for praise. It was Elijah who saw how Ayanna's hands trembled when she lowered her pails, though she never spilled a drop. It was Elijah who watched her brush the dust from her dress with a care so precise it seemed ceremonial. It was Elijah who, one evening, passed her in the barn and quietly mended the broken strap of her bucket with a strip of leather, without asking, without boasting, simply leaving it better than before. Ayanna said nothing. But the next morning, when she found the strap repaired, she paused, laid her hand upon it, and let a breath escape, the smallest sigh, but heavy with meaning. It was the first time since her arrival that her shoulders eased, if only for a moment. The ranch was not only men and cruelty. It had its shadows and its softer edges too. There was the widow in the kitchen, her hands toughened by years of kneading bread, her eyes softer than she let on. She rarely spoke, but sometimes she set aside an extra crust of cornbread, placed not on Jed's plate but on the table where Ayanna worked. No words were exchanged. But kindness, when given in silence, is often the loudest gift of all. There was the stable boy, who carried more mischief than muscle, his grin always tilted sideways. He admired Ayanna quietly. One day he slipped her a wild flower, tucked awkwardly into the handle of her pail. She placed it in her hair without a word. The boy blushed crimson and ran before anyone could notice. And there was old Miguel, the cook, who muttered curses at Jed under his breath, though never where Jed could hear. Miguel would grumble at Ayanna too, pretending annoyance, yet he gave her the choicest piece of meat when no one watched. These were small things, but small things are the stones upon which mountains rest. Jed, meanwhile, began to rot from within. He was a man who fed on attention, and when attention soured, he grew desperate. His nights grew longer at the saloon, his mornings later, his fists quicker to strike the table. He gambled with men who laughed behind his back. He boasted of cattle he never drove, of lands he would never own. He spent coin faster than the ranch could earn it. The cruel jokes at Ayanna's expense became fewer, for they no longer brought laughter. Only Jed's voice remained loud, and it echoed too harshly in the silence. One night, drunk and bitter, he pulled her into the center of the bunkhouse where the men gathered. "Dance," he barked, pushing her forward. "Dance for the men, savage girl. That's all you're good for." The men shifted uneasily. Some laughed out of habit, but it was thin laughter, hollow. Ayanna did not move. She stood, shoulders square, eyes steady. Her silence was louder than his command. The room grew still. Even Jed faltered, his smirk breaking. And in the far corner, Elijah's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Ayanna turned and walked out into the night, the desert swallowing her figure. The silence she left behind was heavier than the room's smoke. In the weeks that followed, Jed grew harsher still. His pride demanded proof that he was in control, though his grip slipped with every sunrise. He barked louder, but fewer listened. Ayanna endured. She endured with the patience of stone, with the grace of the river carving its way through canyon walls. Elijah's quiet presence grew nearer. Not intrusive, not obvious. He fixed tools she used, mended her torn sleeve without asking, left a canteen of water in the path he knew she walked each day. Once, when the sun was cruelest, she stumbled with her load. Elijah stepped forward, lifted the bucket before it could spill, and set it gently back in her hands. Their eyes met then. For a moment, the world's noise fell away. It was not romance that sparked in that silence. It was recognition, the kind that says, "I see your burden. I will not add to it." The ranch hands began to notice. They whispered, some with curiosity, some with malice. But no one dared speak loud enough for Jed to hear. For Jed, though cruel, was still dangerous in his pride. His decline had not yet stripped him of power, and a man clinging to fading authority is more volatile than one who holds it firm. Yet whispers spread, as whispers always do. The widow shook her head quietly when she saw Elijah linger near the stables where Ayanna worked. The stable boy grinned knowingly, too young to understand the weight of what he saw. Miguel muttered to himself that storms were coming, storms with no rain to cool the earth. By the turn of summer, the ranch stood on uneasy ground. Jed grew thinner, his eyes sunken, his laughter more forced. His cruelty became desperate, less about Ayanna, more about clinging to the image of a man no longer respected. He drank until his words slurred. He wagered horses and lost. He demanded the men's loyalty, but their loyalty shifted, unspoken, toward the one who worked beside them. Elijah, steady, patient, never boasting, never breaking. And always in the center of it, Ayanna remained. Not broken, not bowed, but standing. The old voice by the fire paused then, letting the embers hiss. Strength is not always the shout of a man, the voice murmured. Sometimes it is the silence of a woman who refuses to bend. And in that silence, the story deepened. For kindness had begun to bloom, fragile as spring grass, but strong enough to split the stone of cruelty. The desert watched. The wind carried whispers, and the seeds of something greater had been planted. The desert does not rush. It teaches patience. Every stone, every cactus, every bloom that dares to rise from the sand knows that time is the only path to beauty. So it was with Ayanna and Elijah. She did not fall into his arms in a single breath. There were no sudden confessions, no stolen kisses beneath the cottonwoods. Instead, there was the long, quiet weaving of trust, thread by thread, day by day. At first, it was only small things. A repaired strap, a filled canteen, a bucket lifted before it could spill. But those small things became a language between them. When Elijah passed her in the barn, his nod was not empty. It said, "I see you." When she caught his gaze across the yard, her lowered eyes spoke, "I am not afraid of being seen." And slowly, the distance between them became a bridge. Ayanna began to find little places of peace. She planted wildflowers in the cracks near the shed where she slept. Blue petals swayed against the harsh wind, fragile yet unbroken. Children came to her sometimes, the widow's granddaughter, the stable boy with restless hands, and she braided their hair, told them soft stories in the tongue of her people. At night, she hummed songs into the darkness, songs Elijah sometimes heard while he worked late in the stables. He would pause, hammer in hand, and close his eyes, letting her voice rest upon him like rain on dry earth. He did not tell her, not then, but her songs gave him more strength than whiskey ever could. Jed's shadow still loomed. He stumbled further into ruin, cards, dice, bottles, debts. The ranch slipped from his grip like sand through fingers. He mocked Ayanna still, but his voice had grown weaker. His insults landed less like whips, more like the mutterings of a fool. The men who once joined his laughter now avoided his gaze. Some pitied him, some despised him, but few respected him. Still, his pride burned hot, and it was Ayanna who bore the weight of that fire. He forced her to serve him at gatherings, made her stand by the wall while others drank and danced. He boasted to strangers that she was nothing but a burden, a joke sent to shame him. But the strangers no longer laughed. They looked at her, saw her composure, her quiet dignity, and turned their scorn toward Jed instead. And that was what he could not forgive. The turning point came on a night heavy with dust, when the sky glowed with lightning that never touched the ground. Jed staggered into the bunkhouse, drunk and desperate. The men sat at their tables, cards in hand, mugs half full, the air thick with smoke. He shoved Ayanna forward, demanding again that she dance. But this time, she did not simply walk away. She stood her ground, her eyes meeting his with a calm that silenced the room. "I am not yours to command." Her voice rang, soft but steady. It was the first time she had spoken to him since her arrival. The silence that followed was sharper than any blade. Jed's face twisted red with fury. He raised his hand, as if to strike her, and Elijah rose. He did not shout. He did not curse. He simply stepped forward, placing himself between them. His words were plain, but heavy as stone. "That's enough." The room shifted then. The ranch hands who once laughed now leaned back, eyes wide, as though watching a storm break open. Jed's hand fell, though his rage burned hotter than ever. He spat curses at Elijah, called him a traitor, a fool, a coward. But Elijah did not move. His shoulders remained broad, his gaze steady. Ayanna stood behind him, her silence now carrying a new weight, not just endurance, but choice. The men murmured among themselves. Some nodded, some shook their heads, but none stepped in to aid Jed. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. In the days that followed, the ranch held its breath. Jed seethed. He barked louder, drank harder, lost more. He raged at Ayanna, but his words no longer cut as deep, for she knew now she was not alone. Elijah did not declare himself. He did not claim her. He only continued his quiet kindness. But that kindness now carried meaning. He taught her a word of his tongue, river. She taught him one of hers, sky. They spoke little else, but in those two words lay entire worlds. When she hummed, he listened. When he worked, she lingered nearby, her silence no longer armor, but presence. The bond between them grew not in fire, but in roots, slow, unseen, yet strong enough to hold against any storm. Jed's decline became impossible to ignore. He gambled a horse and lost. He wagered land and nearly lost the ranch. He struck a man in the saloon and was thrown out into the dust. The town whispered. The ranch whispered. And every whisper cut at him like a blade. He hated Ayanna more for it, blamed her for his shame. He told himself she cursed him, told the men she was the reason his fortune had soured. But the men no longer listened. They saw with their own eyes who bore dignity and who bore disgrace. One evening, as the sun sank like a burning coin into the horizon, Jed stood before the ranch hands, drunk and furious. "I never wanted her," he spat, pointing toward Ayanna. "She was nothing but a joke, and I'll see her gone by tomorrow." The men looked at one another, uneasy. Ayanna stood still, her face calm as stone, and Elijah stepped forward once more. "She stays," he said, his voice low, but carrying across the yard. The air stilled. Jed laughed bitterly, called him a fool, demanded to know if Elijah thought she belonged to him. But Elijah's gaze did not waver. "She belongs to no man," he said, "but she will not be cast aside." The widow at the porch nodded quietly. The stable boy clutched his cap, eyes wide. Miguel muttered, "So it begins." And Ayanna, for the first time since her arrival, felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not to swallow her, but to hold her steady. The old voice by the fire leaned close then, eyes glinting in the glow. "Kindness is not weakness," the voice whispered. "Is the slow fire that shapes iron into steel. And when cruelty thinks it has won, kindness waits, patient as the desert, until the day it blooms into love." The embers hissed, sparks rising like stars. The desert wind carried whispers of storms to come, and though no one yet knew it, the final reckoning drew near. The desert has a way of bringing truth into the open. It strips away lies the way wind strips the bark from a dead tree. What remains is what was always there, bare, unhidden, undeniable. So it was when the storm finally came to the ranch. Jed could not stand the silence any longer. It gnawed at him worse than laughter ever had. His pride, once fat with mockery, had grown lean and bitter. Word had spread through town. The saloon spoke of his debts. The blacksmith muttered about unpaid coin. Even the preacher shook his head when Jed swaggered past. And in every whisper, in every sidelong glance, Jed swore he saw Ayanna's shadow. He told himself she was the cause, the curse, the reason he had fallen. And hatred burned hotter in him than whiskey ever could. It was evening when it came to a head. The sky stretched wide and purple, thunder growling in the distance, though no rain dared fall. The men had gathered in the yard, weary from a long drive, their faces lined with dust and doubt. Jed stumbled from the house, bottle in hand, rage burning in his blood. He called for Ayanna, his voice sharp, cruel, desperate to prove he still held power. She stepped forward, calm as ever. Her silence cut sharper than his words. "You were given as a joke," he spat, his face twisted, "and that's all you'll ever be. I'll see you gone before another sunrise." The men shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, some clenched their fists, and Elijah stepped forward. It was not a duel with pistols at dawn. It was not the clatter of spurs or the thunder of hooves. It was two men standing in the dust, with the eyes of the ranch upon them. Jed shouted, cursed, hurled insults like stones. Elijah said little, but every word landed heavier than any blow. "She is not yours to shame," Elijah said. "She is not yours to cast aside." Jed lunged, fists swinging wild. Elijah caught the blow, pushed him back with the steadiness of a man who knew his own strength. They grappled in the dust, the crowd shouting, some urging them apart, others frozen with the weight of it. Jed fought with desperation, his movements clumsy, fueled by pride. Elijah fought with calm, his strikes measured, his restraint clear. And in the end, Jed fell, face down in the dirt, his pride shattered where no bullet could reach. He rose once, twice, but the men did not help him. Their silence told him the truth. His reign was finished. Ayanna stepped forward then. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair loose around her shoulders, but her gaze was steady as the horizon. She looked at Jed, not with hatred, but with pity. "You were given power," she said softly, "and you wasted it." He flinched as if struck, for her words carried more weight than all of Elijah's blows. Then she turned away, and in that turning, Jed was left behind. He stumbled from a yard, his shadow shrinking into the desert dusk, swallowed by silence. The men did not follow. The ranch did not grieve his leaving. The days after were different, quieter, steadier. Ayanna no longer walked with eyes lowered. She spoke more, not loudly, but enough for her voice to become part of the ranch's rhythm. She taught the children her songs. She planted more wildflowers by the shed until the yard bloomed with color. The men found themselves speaking to her with respect, not mockery. The widow smiled when Ayanna entered the kitchen, handing her bread without hiding the gesture. Miguel grumbled less and hummed more when she was near. The stable boy brought her gifts of feathers and pebbles, treasures of a child's heart. And through it all, Elijah remained at her side, never claiming, never demanding, only walking beside her as if it had always been so. Their union did not come with trumpets or church bells. It was a quiet vow, spoken beneath the open sky, with the widow and Miguel as witnesses, the stable boy fidgeting at their side. Ayanna took his name, not as a mark of possession, but as a bond of choice. Her spirit did not bend to fit into his. It stood beside his, equal, unbroken. And the ranch, once filled with cruelty, began to carry the echo of her songs. The old voice by the fire paused then, staring into the embers as if they carried the past. She was sent as a joke, the voice whispered, but jokes fade. She returned with his last name, not because she was claimed, but because she chose. And that is the difference. That is the power no man can strip away. The fire hissed, sparks rising into the night. Perhaps you wonder what became of Jed. Some say he wandered town to town, losing more than he won, a man cursed by his own pride. Others say the desert took him, swallowed him whole beneath shifting sands. But his ending matters little, for this tale is not about him. It is about the woman who refused to break, and the man who saw her strength when others laughed. It is about the power of kindness, the patience of love, the dignity of choice. And it is about you listening now. For every one of us has felt the weight of being mocked, of being cast aside, of being treated as less. And every one of us hungers for the moment when someone sees us, truly sees us, and says, without pride, without noise, you belong. So remember her story, whispered by firelight. Remember that the desert does not laugh. It only waits until truth is laid bare. And now, to you who have listened all this way, if this tale touched your heart, linger a while. Share your thoughts. Let your voice join the whispers of this fire. Like, comment, and subscribe, so these stories of love and dignity may keep breathing. And tell me, friend, from where are you watching this old tale of the West?